G'day everybody, welcome back to the pod for another week. Matt Walsh, Rohan Connolly stepping into the hot seat, and champion data's Christian Joly here to talk all things footy for another week. And we have a lot to get to today, including dissecting the Bombers and the Dockers' poor starts to the year. We're going to look at the 45 kick plus some expected scores stuff and a whole lot more. Rohan, good to have you back on the podcast. Fortuitous, perhaps. It comes after a week in which your Bombers have given us so much material.
Yeah, talk about deja vu. It's amazing how often Essendon play like crap. I fire up about it, then all of a sudden I'm doing guest spots on podcasts. You can make a living out of it, Matt.
Absolutely, you could. You've written something for the website espn.com.au/AFL if you want to read those thoughts. Christian, good to have you back on the pod as always. I might start with you with this one. Something you noticed from round 2.
I'll be honest, I'm probably 3 weeks late with this one, so it's not quite round 2 I've noticed this, but running my eye over the 45 kicks, so we can sort of give the listeners a bit of a rundown this week on who's performing the 45 kick the most. But I sort of looked at my spreadsheet and realised the very, very first kick of the 2025 season, Jarman Impey against the Swans, was a 45 kick. So if anyone's inquiring, to see an example of a 45 kick or exactly what we're trying to record, just go back and look at the first kick of the season, and that's what we're
That's
tracking.
your research done.
Yep.
Yeah. It was interesting when you hear, I guess, coaches and commentators, ex-players, especially in a lot of these cases, refer to this sort of stuff, and then it gets within the lexicon, and then all of a sudden, champion data's starting to record it. I'm trying to think when it first sort of came into vogue, that saying, and how long it would take kind of, I guess, statisticians to pick up on that and say, hey, that's something we can use.
I reckon 2 or 3 years, Christian.
Yeah, I was going to say, at least crossed out. We actually, when we built it, we found that when we built the original software in 2010 or updated in 2012, 45 had been put in there as a definition. We hadn't captured it and it hasn't been turned on, but we were surprised to see, okay, back in 2012, someone had thought about 45 because we have 3 directions for a kick. You can either go backwards, lateral, or forwards. We've added the 4th direction, which is your 45 kick. That was actually sort of hidden away in the back end. So it's been, that's 12 or 13 years ago that it was actually mentioned. But yeah, actually defining the kick, working if it works into the rest of the other stuff we're calling. So as I said, this will fall into the long down the line, the switches, and the 45 kick will give you a complete picture of what you're trying to do with the ball. But yeah, I think the biggest one is defining it and coming up with a definition that the whole industry sort of can roll with, and that's what I think we've found.
Could we get whoever came up with that to interpret the pre-game interview between Nathan Buckley and Ross Lyon on Saturday night? Because Bucks asked Ross a question, Ross responded with 2 or 3 of the most jargon-laden, unintelligible stuff I reckon I've ever heard.
I've got to say, when you talk about footy jargon, the thing that comes to my mind is hamstring awareness that came out a few years ago. And when I first heard that, I thought that is ridiculous, unbelievable, can't believe they're coming up with this kind of stuff and giving it to the punters. I'm all about it. Because you know what, as you get a bit older and if you're still active, you find that you are aware of a lot of your muscles very quickly.
What about the way
if you do strain them, you are. I can tell you now, you're very aware of them.
What about the way some injuries just come into vogue and then totally disappear?
Well,
whatever happened to osteoiditis pubis?
Syndesmosis is hot at the moment.
Syndesmosis. When did that suddenly appear? It used to be an ankle injury.
Rohan, something you noticed from round 2.
I love feel-good footy stories, and I have got a soft spot for North Melbourne, always have had, and I've loved the way they've stuck to their guns even through 5 pretty dismal years, bottom 2 finishes, and they're starting to reap the rewards. And it was just marvellous that last quarter of theirs yesterday, the kids, the zest with which they played. But above and beyond all that, what I loved most was the reaction of the crowd. It was, everyone gets into North about their crowds, but they were loud, and it was like 5 years of pent-up frustration being exorcised.
Well, it's their biggest win since round 9 2020. So you talk about 5 years. It is literally their biggest win in 5 years. But
it was so exciting. It was very hard even for a non-North person not to get caught up in it. So good on them, and I love that for the North supporters. They deserve it.
Definitely. Hey, something I noticed, one of those bizarre moments that you find in some games every now and then. This was during Brisbane versus West Coast. What you would think would be a very normal holding the ball call on a tackle on Will Ashcroft, sort of on the wing. The Eagles stopped, the Lions stopped. Everyone's expecting the Eagles player to just pick the footy up, go back to the top of the mark and do the kick. Except no umpire had blown the whistle. And for about 2 or 3 seconds, all the players in the immediate vicinity stood completely still and didn't know what to do. And I thought that was one of the strangest things I've seen. And I guess it kind of sums up a pretty bizarre week for the umps who didn't really cover themselves in glory from...
Saw something similar Thursday night, the Carlton Hawthorn game. I can't remember which team it was. I think it might have been Hawthorn. Kicked it out of the back line and ball went out of bounds and sort of the umpires just stopped. They called out of bounds, and one umpire asked the other umpire whether it should be deliberate or insufficient intent, and the other umpire didn't respond, and they didn't know what to do. They just froze for about a good
I think I know what you're talking about.
No decision being made at all.
That was the boundary umpire called it touched off the boot. The boundary umpire went to the controlling umpire and said, no, this was touched, it's a throw-in. And because the controlling umpire didn't see it, they had a conversation for about 10 seconds when nobody knew what was going on. And the controlling umpire said, well, I didn't see it, so throw it in.
Yeah.
So it should have been actually a free kick to the Blues. Sorry, it should have been touched. I can't remember what it was. But anyway, it was just this bizarre when no one knew what was going on for about 5 seconds.
I want to stick up for the umpires in the Brisbane West Coast one, because you can have a go at the umpires, but like, what do you learn as a kid? Play to the whistle. It's kid stuff.
Fair enough. Hey, we're going to get cracking into this week's episode. In the early parts of every new season, there are teams who exceed early expectations, and then there are, of course, disappointments as well. Last year's bottom 4 teams, for instance, have all shown glimpses. We've talked about North Melbourne being 1-1, Adelaide 2-0, Eagles 0-2, but they showed some good signs against the reigning premiers on the road, and of course the Tigers 1-1. But some teams, Rohan, like Fremantle and like Essendon, have disappointed compared to some lofty off-season expectations.
Well, I wasn't expecting anything out of Essendon. I had them,
and yet they've somehow disappointed you.
Well, they've never failed to disappoint. No, I put Essendon 13th on the ladder. I've said for years I don't think their list is anywhere near it. I was a bit more bullish about Freo. I think I put them 5th. I was down at Geelong for last week's obliteration, and they were woeful. But that game last night, I mean, they're playing the runner-up, and they lost by a kick after leading with a couple of minutes to go. So I don't think it's panic stations yet. My issue with Freo, and Christian, I think you've got some stats on it, is just that he's a very conservative coach, Justin Longmuir, and I think they really struggle, even with their best selves. They want to sort of move the ball quicker and attack more, but I think that natural conservatism always seems to get in the way.
Yeah, they have, and they've been one of the highest handballing teams across the competition for in total number of handballs. But then you look at the stat that we cover a lot on the podcast is the handball meters gained. It's actually taking territory with those handballs. They sort of top 6 this year for it, but last year number 1 handballing team and sort of in the bottom half for actual meters gained from those handballs. So they're not taking.
So that means they're getting mired down in contests and close quarters, and you think they're not actually getting space to use those handballs.
Yeah, you think the same type of handballs that the GWS, the tsunami that they caused with it, Collingwood sort of what they've been able to do in the last few years.
Well, Richmond were doing it, but
Richmond started it probably in 2017. So Freo using the hand as much as those teams, but it's just more sideways and backwards handballs. Even their kicks, they end up going backwards to Luke Ryan a lot and sort of coming out, sort of going fast by hand, one kick backwards, it really slows them up and then they start again. So they haven't got that continual wave going forward.
So you say you're not as concerned about the Dockers, but it's now 6 straight losses. They actually haven't won since July, I think I saw, because they had such a poor end of the season after being entrenched in the top 4 for most of last year.
But I think they lost their last 4 home and away games, but I'm pretty sure 3 of them were literally by a kick. I think the biggest margin was about 20 points of those 4 losses.
Well, that would be a worry as well. And then you look at the 2 games they've played this year, they've added, offensive firepower in the form of Shea Bolton in particular. And you look at some of the names down there and how these guys are, normally quite accurate kicks. But last week it was 4 goals to a first gamer. This week it was Tracy kicking 4 goals. But that's it. They scored 9 and 10 goals in the last couple of weeks. And this is a team that, many had competing for a flag and being a top 4 team.
Can I just say one thing here? Brisbane lost first 3 games last year. Hawthorn lost their first 5. Year before, Carlton, GWS, both in the bottom 4 at round 15.
It is true. And I think this is the thing, these are these overreactions that you can have early and tend to have early in a season, especially when you come to the media where you can only have a look at the sample size in front of you. But there are definitely some worrying signs for the Dockers.
But with Freo, it's probably, including the last 4 games last year, so it's 6 losses in a row now. You just look at their stats in that time, so the last 6 games, they're 14th for points for in that time, 16th for scores from turnover, and 16th for score per inside 50. So a lot of their scores sort of come from clearances in that time because they're so dominant in the clearances. They've lost it, I think, in both games this year and are sort of in the bottom 2 for clearance differential this year. So their main strength last year has deserted them this year. It's not there. But I sort of did this exercise with a lot of the teams and just looked at a whole heap of stats and sort of if you win or get to a certain benchmark in a stat and how often you win. A lot of the teams they might win with a certain stat 70% of the time compared to 40%, things like that. But Freo, they had a number of stats where it's just a huge difference in terms of it really sets themselves
up. Side of a marker.
So something simple like just being ahead at 3/4 time. This is since the start of last season. if they're ahead at three-quarter time, they win 74% of games. If they're behind at three-quarter time, they're 1 in 19, which is a 5% success rate. So not a team to sort of come back with a flurry late in games. And we spoke about, they've lost a few close games, but haven't been able to get themselves in front.
Just on that, the Geelong game I think is pretty instructive because they had that burst from Murphy Reid. And I think it was 21 points at three-quarter time. First 8 minutes of the last quarter was a 0-0 draw, but once they conceded the first goal, they just folded. It was a 10-goal quarter.
Yeah, so another sort of, a cheeky number to choose, but you choose 93 points or more. So if they get to 93 or score more, they're 17 from 17, so 100% win rate. If they don't score 93, they're 5 out of 29, which is a 17% win rate. Clearances, 61% win rate when they win the clearances, 18% when they don't win the clearances. And then if they outscore the opposition from clearances, they win 74% of the time. When they've been outscored from clearances, they're 2 wins in 21 games, which is a 9% win rate. So got to win the stoppages, got to win the clearances, and got to put sort of 93 points or so on the board, which, as I said, they only do each of those things in about 50, 60% of the games anyway.
I think the middle is a bit of a worry at the moment, and maybe that gets helped when Hayden Young comes back. I think he's a really important cog in that machine. You look at the output of Andrew Brayshaw and Caleb Sarong in the last start in particular, they were fine. They just weren't at their prolific best, and I think someone like Young really comes in and can help that as well. So I think it'll get better for the Dockers, and as you say, Rohan, it's 2 weeks in, 3 for some teams, but it's 2 weeks into the season and things can happen. But when you're a coach like Justin Longmuir is, under the pressure he was coming into this season, to start this way has been pretty disappointing.
Yeah, no, look, I was having a look at Bolton and just thinking he needs a few under his belt, I reckon. They'll be a much better side when they can sort of inject him into that midfield mix a bit more too.
Well, expectations, as you say, weren't as high on the Bombers in the pre-season. Some had them making finals, others had them around the mark, and you might have had them a bit lower. But all the good faith from that round one effort against the Hawks seems to have gone out the door with that 61-point loss to Adelaide, where they gave up 161 points. Your overarching thoughts as a rusted on Dons man?
Disgraceful. Look, there's 2 stories here. One is, and this column I've written for ESPN, I've looked at the bigger picture view, but I'm afraid there is 2 stories. One is the immediate, quality of a list, coaching sort of argument. But that to me is only a small part of the bigger story, which is the malaise with the players. The fact that this playing group can be good one week and they get blown away the next in round 2, mind you. It's a weak club. Essendon is a weak football club. They've been weak in the playing group for a long time, but the culture is weak. The standards are weak. And I think this group running the club now is aware of that and is doing everything in its power to change it. But the neglect has been so profound for so long now, and we're talking about almost 25 years, that it will take years and years to get to a point where the right standards and examples are being set. Now, that all might sound a bit namby-pamby to people, but I'm telling you, the end result of that is defenders who are playing off their man, is midfielders who aren't running back hard enough defensively, is players who get a little bit down and then throw in the towel. These are and some of the more senior Essendon players are some of the worst exponents of this. Andy McGrath, who's a vice captain, some of his defensive efforts were appalling. He's a turnover merchant. He's a panic merchant. And I think, the fans are getting very sick of hearing these same guys talk the talk every week and not walking the walk. Ben Mackay, obviously a lot of fingers being pointed at him, but that's working out badly. Another thing, 2 things for me stand out at the moment. One is that you lose a key defender in Ridley, and that's enough to destabilise the whole back line. You lose an important forward in Kyle Langford, and the whole forward structure looks totally impotent. The other one is the number of players who are being played not in the positions they were recruited to play. So you've got Shield playing as a half-back.
Yep.
You've got a Ruckman in Draper playing as a de facto key forward. There's a third one there I'm desperately trying to remember at the moment.
Harry Jones on a wing.
Harry Jones on a wing. And Harry Jones, to me, is symptomatic of the deficiencies in recruiting and player development. And, if you want to be really forensic about it, go through. They've had, I think it was 6 first-round picks playing in that side on Saturday, and they're all vanilla. Jones was a pick 30, but Sartis, Hobbs, the 3 busts out of the 2020 draft, Cox, Reid, Perkins. This is a a very untalented playing group. There's one star in the whole group, and that's Zach Merritt. Worse than that, you go back to since 2000, I would argue Essendon has recruited 2 players who have become champions. One of them is Zach Merritt, and the other one is Jobe Watson, who was a father-son they had priority access to anyway. It's been absolutely dismal. And yes, Adrian Dodoro has to wear a lot of the responsibility for that, but so do the people doing development, so do the administrators who appointed those guys to the development group or the football department. And gets back to my bigger picture thing, that the whole club has made a series of poor decisions, of which the poorest obviously was the decision to use supplements. But a series of poor decisions have almost turned the club belly up, and I think it'll take years still until they're at a level that other clubs take for granted.
So it's interesting, I mean, obviously comes from a place of passion and obviously, you
a longer-term lens.
Yeah. But I looked at it, a lot of things you're saying sort of ring true in terms of the numbers that I've written down. So one of the stats that sort of come across my desk this morning is Brad Scott, 12 years he's been a coach. So he coached North Melbourne for all those years and now at Essendon. None of those years has he finished top 6 for points against. So top 6 for points against, you've got to be in top 6 to win a premiership. He's never been there in the 12 years of coaching.
We talk about premiership metrics. We talked about them a lot on the podcast last year and the year before. We'll probably talk about them as finals approach a bit more on this pod as well. But you've got to be top 6 defensively. Yeah. And he's never had a team that's done that. Yeah,
correct. So that comes back to, so he's never been a defensive coach, but the team that he took over, so you look at going back to 2016, so Worsfold had him from 2016 to 2020. The Bombers were 15th for points against, 16th for points against from turnover, and 16th for defending ball movement from the back half. Rutten takes over for a couple of years. They go to 14th for points against, 15th for points against from turnover, and 17th for defending the ball from the defensive half. And now Scott's taken over. They've been 15th for points against, 15th for points against from turnover, and 15th for defending ball movement from defensive half. So 3 identical profiles with 3 totally different coaches that would all be coming in and seeing the same profile and thinking, this is the side of the ball we need to be fixed. For, what's that? It's almost reaching 10 years now and it's sort of been an issue. So listening to you sort of saying how it might be a mindset of the club and things like that, it's really interesting to me because it's like, well, no one out of any of these coaches, no one has actually been able to sort of get them into out of the bottom 4 really.
And this is my point, that the leaders, the guys who pass for leaders at that club, none of them have really played with successful teams. So they're not sure, even with their best intentions, they're not sure of the level of work and commitment which is actually required.
You talk about sort of the last 25 years, going back as far as you want, but more contemporary times. When you look at this year in isolation, I know it is a small sample size, but are there signs that are very worrying for Essendon fans?
Oh, definitely. So talk about effort against Hawthorn, and it was great, but still finished that round in the bottom 5 of a lot of sort of defensive measures, which is, all the rankings sort of dropped to last after the Crows game. So points against, they've given up the most of anyone this year. They've been the easiest team to score against once inside 50. They conceded the most points from turnovers, which 109 of those were on the weekend against the Crows, which is Adelaide's, I think, equal 4th most in any game that they've recorded. Just look at every single chain and how often that leads to a score. Essendon are 18th for defending kick-ins, clearances, intercepts, so put them all together. They're 18th. The one for me, I mean, again, Adelaide put such a big score on them that it's going to sort of blow these numbers out. But they're 17th for points conceded from forward half chains and 18th for points conceded from back half chains. So they're getting beaten by being bogged down in their back half and conceding scores, but they're also getting scored against from the transition. So
the one that here that sticks out to me is they're 18th, so worse in the competition for pressure applied.
Yeah, so
that's not having the ball for.
Yeah, that's just so. This is more of a team setup thing. Not being able to defend inside 50 entries. It's probably 6 or 7 defenders that's on. Pressure acts is just getting to the guy with the ball. Just get into his face, get a hand on him or something to get your pressure applied up. They're 18th for that, so they're not putting any pressure on the ball carrier, and their structure behind the ball is clearly not stacking up either.
All I'd say about Brad Scott is, and the natives are getting restless, and they're beginning to follow the same pattern, which is the coach cops it. And this is why I'm sort of, as a Essendon person, I'm desperate for the Essendon fan base to see that these issues are so endemic that in a way the coaches are relevant. I mean, I'm not saying he's irrelevant, but you could have Jock McHale coaching this group at the moment, and the same things would be happening. And Brad Scott, I think, can be a really good coach for Essendon away from the ground almost, in setting the standards around the club and around training. And my mail is that these things are in fact happening and those attitudes are turning around. But it's a slow burn, and it's going to take future generations of players who deliver on these newly set up standards. We're not going to see it with this playing group.
To use your logic against you, Rohan, we're only 2 games into the season and maybe things can turn around, but we'll keep a close eye on the Bombers, that's for sure, going forward. A couple more teams before we move on which seem to have a similar issue to one another, and that's Carlton and Melbourne. Both were sort of expected to be thereabouts in contention, but they both seem to struggle with that last kick inside 50, Christian. And I know that fans of both teams will know these frustrations all too well, but it is quite damning. They can't seem to find a target.
Yeah, so both teams... So Carlton's gone through a little bit of a back and forth stage. So 2023, they were tick defensively and across offensively, even though they got into finals. 2024, same thing, just snuck into finals. They were a tick offensively, but across defensively, so it switched. This year, they're back to being they're number one for, we just spoke about pressure on the ball carrier. They're number one for that. Sort of the second hardest side to score against per inside 50, so behind the ball is good. But they're 17th for scoring from their own inside 50s, and we've seen sort of 2 weeks in a row, especially against Richmond with 25 more entries and not being able to get the job done. I think to have, had 60-odd entries and scored 60 points or so. So it's not a great ratio to get. So Carlton and Melbourne, when we speak about them and we speak about Goodwin, they've always been great defensively at the contest and things like that. But you look at take into the last 3 seasons if you want, they've had the 7th most kicks inside 50, the 7th most kicks into the forward 50, but the 3rd highest loss rate. So most of their kicks are, 40-odd% of their kicks are going straight to the opposition and coming back out.
I find the Carlton example fascinating, Christian, because those rankings have stuck in my head the last couple of years. It was almost a mirror image last year, 4th and 14th, 4th for attack, 14th for defence, and 9th and 4th the other way around the previous year. So it's all about, I mean, I'm not saying I'm a coach, but it appears to be about balance. You need to balance the amount you invest in defence with the amount you attack. And it seems like that's an issue for Michael Voss. Interestingly, I don't know if you guys saw it, but there was some footage of him speaking to the playing group immediately after the game in the rooms. And he was talking about how the contest was great. And it absolutely was. But I don't know, it's like, I sort of feel like Vossi sort of loads up in one area and then the other things that
once they get out of the contest, what happens next?
Yeah,
I think that's what let Carlton down, in the first two weeks of this year at least.
But it's that capacity, I mean, the really good sides are the sides which can just get that absolute spot-on balance of attack with defence, and I think Carlton struggle with that.
Well, the issue is if they kind of balance it out in, say, 8th and 8th, you've got to be top 6 somewhere defensively to be in premiership contention, and maybe that just says the Blues aren't there.
Not yet. So both Carlton and Melbourne have been, as I said, for 3 or 4 years, been up there for defence, but struggled with offensively. We know Melbourne at least got themselves a premiership recently, but haven't won a final since, so it's been an issue for them as well. But you talk about those 2 teams and comparing them. We spoke about Carlton last year on the podcast and said when they go inside 50, they were sort of the 2nd most contested marks inside 50, but 17th for uncontested marks. Melbourne's sort of the opposite way. So they're sort of uncontested marks inside 50, they're 7th. So they can sort of find an open target, but they're 17th for contested marks inside 50. So their issue is the other way, that they do a lot of bomb kicks into the forward 50 and they don't have a consistent key forward taking those marks. So I think Van Rooyen's better out on a lead. Gawn's probably been their number 1 contested marker up forward, and he's not a full-time forward. Whereas Carlton have got the opposite. So Melbourne can find a lot of sort of easy targets in not valuable positions, but if they do go for the long bomb, they can't take a mark. Carlton the opposite. They rely on the long bomb. All they can do is take back marks, contested marks, because they can't find the short, easy options. So
I was waiting for you to mention the guy I feel like is the barometer for Melbourne. That's Bailey Fritsch. And he was poor the second half of last year, and he appears to have been pretty poor.
That's had a stinker on the weekend.
I mean, I could do the hair joke easily enough, but I won't. But he really is when I think about taking, uncontested marks out in the lead or whatever, I tend to think of him. He seems to straighten up the whole forward line in the same way that in 21 when they won the flag, and I've pumped this bloke up religiously as a result, But Ben Brown was the guy who helped deliver that flag to them because he straightened up all their attack.
Yeah.
And it's just fascinating because it was another game in which Melbourne was comfortably beaten on the scoreboard but won the inside 50 count. It tends to happen a fair bit when you look at their games a little bit more closely. Hey, speaking of scores and all that kind of stuff, expected scores continues to be an interesting stat to track. For those who are sort of just joining us on the podcast for the first time or those who might have forgotten, it's the likelihood of a player scoring a goal, taking into account the shot type, such as set shots, snaps, or on the run, the location on the field, and the pressure at the point of the kick. So xScores has become all the rage as well in the last couple of years, and you've been tracking that. And there's been some interesting things to start the season that you've noticed.
Yeah, so if we just look at sort of exactly looking at the score that you should have kicked if you had a kick to competition accuracy and what your opposition should have scored had they kicked to competition accuracy. So you look at this round, for instance, there was 3 games where the results could have flipped had accuracy been sort of maintained by both teams. So
Averaged out, yeah.
a couple of close ones. So St Kilda should have won by St Kilda should have won by 7 points, but actually lost. Sorry, so they should have won by 4 points, but they actually lost by 7 points.
Geelong.
Geelong.
Geelong should have won.
Sorry, got those two mixed up. Geelong should have won by 7 points, but lost. Geelong should have won by 4 points and lost. Sydney was similar, so they got the win over Freo by 3 points, should have lost by 2. So it's a 5-point turnaround in that game, an 11-point turnaround in the St Kilda Geelong game. It was the Carlton Hawthorn game on Thursday night. Carlton should have won that game by 6 points and lost it by 20, so a sort of 26-point turnaround.
Maybe 4 posters on the night for the Blues. So, you talk about thin margins.
Yeah, and then just the goals that, Joly, snapping from the pocket and things like that.
Yep.
The shots that
Gunston
Carlton couldn't nail, yeah.
Just on that too, my memory of Hawthorn early last year, and they lost their first 5, but I remember certainly the first game they lost to Essendon. They had plenty of opportunities and didn't convert. So they appear to have really cleaned up their efficiency.
Yeah. So going back to the Blues, they've actually, so that's the second week in a row that they've won the expected scores but lost on the actual real scoreboard.
Moral victors.
Yeah, sort of that was
the England cricket team.
How many points do you get for that?
Yeah, 0, unfortunately. But yeah, so that's, it's one of those things in the industry. Some people love to use expected scores because it tells you, it gives you a good guide on how the game was played out, taking out the unluckiness of luckiness of accuracy. Whereas some people are exactly the same thing. Well, who cares if you win expected accuracy? You need to actually win the real scores. But just that question of Carlton being 2 and zip and sort of what does that mean? Is that something you can sort of hang your hat on and say it's not as dire for the Blues this year? And as I said, it's a hard one to sort of judge for Carlton at the moment because it's a clear they can't score. It's the only thing in their game at the moment is 17th for points for, second worst team for scoring once inside 50.
I reckon they would take some hope out of that because I go back to 2023 and when they were 15th or whatever it was after 15 rounds. I remember talking to you about it, Christian. All their defensive stuff was really solid and it was just about that conversion.
So it is.
So you'd rather be that way than scoring a lot and your defence be porous like Essendon.
I think there is a case to be had for similar to Melbourne, and whether we keep talking in Carlton Melbourne in the same sort of conversation, but they do have very similar profiles, where you get too stuck up on it. And I go back to your point where you said about 10 minutes ago about Essendon, sort of judging having a successful culture without having been part of a successful culture. Yeah. It's similar to what Carlton are doing. They've sort of pumping themselves up, and you go back to Voss's post-game speech to them in the thing, and you think, he's sort of telling them, keep the resilience, we're doing well, we're doing right. And it's like, can you get stuck in this stage for too long where it's like you've only got half the game nailed out and you keep pointing to that saying, we're fine, we just got to make a few tweaks. But if you can't make those, if it's 2 or 3 years get by and you haven't made those tweaks yet, when are those tweaks coming?
Okay, so what's the common denominator between Carlton and Essendon? They've both won the most AFL flags and they've both been crap for 25 years.
They might be an okay team.
As I keep saying, joined at the hip in mediocrity, Carlton and Essendon.
We teased this in the pre-season and earlier in the pod that Champion Data would be tracking the 45 kick in 2025. So the incisive ball, either inboard or outboard on that slide angle that's neither straight, neither across the ground or neither backwards. We hear commentators and ex-players talking about it a lot, as I've said. Who does it the most, Christian? I know you've only had 2, potentially 3 games worth of data, but is there any team in particular that seems to be using it more than others?
Yeah, so Hawthorn have clearly done it the most. I think it started in, as I said, the very, very first kick of their season. Impey was a 45 and they went really, really high in that game against Sydney. Probably brought it back their next 2 games since, but across their 3 games they've had 74 45 kicks in total.
So an average of 24 and a bit.
Yeah, and GWS in their 2 games have had 54 in total. So those two are a clear way out. Sydney have played the 3 games, have had 45 kicks, which say that 3 times fast. So about 12 or so per game. And then right down the other end, it's interesting. The bottom 4 teams are Brisbane, 12 45 kicks, and Port Adelaide, 12 45 kicks. So we know Brisbane in the grand final last year had some of the best. We weren't tracking 45s for the whole year, but when we redid the grand final, which we just wanted to use as our testing and our, to train for definitions and things like that, some of their 45 kicks that they hit in the grand final were some of the best we'd seen all year. So they've only done it 12 times so far. Port Adelaide 12 times, obviously had 1 week where they were really smashed and 1 week where they were really on. And then Freo and Richmond 10 times each, sort of the slower ball movement team. So very, very early days. We will get into more metrics hopefully later in the season of 45 kicks in certain zones and how often they lead to scores and things like that, so who is actually scoring the most. But it's interesting to see that, the leader at the moment, albeit with an extra game, is Hawthorn with 74 and last is Richmond with 10. So you never want to come up with a stat where every team's just doing the same amount every single game. So it's good that tick 1 is there's a huge variance of what teams are trying to do. The next is, as I said, we'll dive into it hopefully every second podcast. It's who's giving up the most and what's happening from these 45s.
The Brisbane one I think is really interesting in particular because you talk about such a control versus chaos. We talked about that last year being ground ball gets versus uncontested marks, and Brisbane is a control game. Yep. They love a control game. So it's kind of strange to me that I guess when you talk about the grand final and how they use the 45 kick to such to their advantage, how this year it seems to has disappeared just ever so slightly.
Yeah, so 3 games in.
Well, it's an obvious question to ask here, I think, on behalf of the layperson. So sorry if you can't answer it. I'm not sure I can. Why is a 45 kick so valuable and damaging?
Yeah, so that's the next step to it, to find out if it is damaging. So we
don't know that it's damaging.
So that's the next thing. So because we haven't...
Each chain is different, right? Yeah. The eye test will tell you that 45 kick is damaging, but this one isn't.
Yeah.
There'll be times where you go inside and suddenly it opens up the fat side.
Well,
or there'll be times where it gets intercepted.
I guess my guess would be that it's the unpredictability because you're changing the angle.
Yeah, so that's the whole thing, is changing the lane. So instead of going down the same boundary, we're now going all of a sudden, we were on the boundary, now all of a sudden we've got the ball in the corridor. So with a lot of these stats though, it probably doesn't need to necessarily mean that 45 equals win. Do 45 well equals win.
Yep.
That's not what we're looking for. It's sort of to give a bigger picture. So when you're trying to, or a coach is trying to analyse a game, we know if a team's trying to switch and we know if a team's going long down the line. What we can do is add the 45s in and we can sort of see from each position, what is the team trying to do? What do they do? If they go long down the line, do they score more often than the opposition, or does the opposition win it back and score? So it just gives you more knowledge on what works and what doesn't work for you. I don't think the 45 kick, similar to the switch kick, it's not like we'll end up with something like you need to switch 10 times a game to win, because every team is set up differently and built differently. You need to look at your own profile and go, is it worth us? So Hawthorn, when they look at it, very easy to say, okay, we're much better when we switch than when we go long down the line.
But you would think, wouldn't you, that if you can switch with a 45 kick rather than laterally, that's going to be more beneficial because you're going forward and you're on the move.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah, potentially.
And then the other one of that is if you can intercept that kick, that's going to lead to probably a score 80% of the time compared to 20. So it's also how dangerous, how much of a gamble are we taking this kick? How safe is it for us to do this? If we miss it, how much is it going to hurt us the other way versus how much is it worth us attempting?
This is great stuff, because this is what we as supporters want to know. Whereas, a lot of the commentators, they'll just start using a bit of jargon like that, and there's the assumption everyone knows why that's a good thing.
Yeah. I think once you start tracking zones of whether you're starting in the back half or in the backfield or whatever it might be, and how effectively these are used, we'll start to get a bigger data point on whether it's successful and whether more equals good and less equals bad and all that kind of stuff.
We can stop using that interpreter for Ross Lyon's press conference.
Exactly right. Anything else from round 2 that took your fancy? I know that you talk about score sources. I think the Kangaroos had some really big numbers from centre bounce.
Yeah, so when you talk about North Melbourne at the start, that's what I was thinking. So they scored 43 points, 7 goals won directly from centre bounces, which set a new club record for them. So they never scored that many. They've scored 42 points once from centre bounces. But yeah, just looked at it. We spoke about Hawthorn's personnel in their defensive 50 in the first week of the podcast with Jake and how scary that is. North centre bounce setup doesn't have Wardlaw in there yet, but at the moment they're rolling with Davies, Uniacke, Sheasel, Luke Parker, who just gives them that point of difference and that experience. And then they just throw Tom Powell in there every now and again. And yeah, they'll add Wardlaw to it. So a clear strength is going to be how much they get you out of the centre, and they were able to, as I said, put 43 points on the board straight out of there against Melbourne and really set them up for a win. Down back, they got Charlie Comben, who took 8 intercept marks, so we know the record's 10. He grabbed 8, and then down the other end you had guys like, I mentioned Luke Parker, he had 22 touches, 11 score involvements. Paul Curtis, 22 touches, 11 score involvements. I think Zerha was 17 touches, 10 score involvements. So just so many of their guys had almost career best games all on the same day. But guys, like young guys that you can see, they'll be able to carry this and continue going forward.
I've got to say that, like, I reckon they copped a bit of flack about it, North, picking up Parker, Darling and Daniel. All of those three yesterday, I looked at them, you could absolutely see the value. You could see...
It's one on each line too. It's well spread out.
And Darling's work ethic and attitude really helped free up Larkey. Daniel's distribution off half-back, Parker in the middle. It's inspired, I think. And I bet there'll be games where they all three have a poor one. Someone will go, see, they've picked up these has-beens. But I think in a side that has as much youthful talent as they've got, they were a perfect addition to the blend.
And kind of to that point, I think similar with Jackson McRae at St Kilda, had a great day. And the Saints, and I'm not saying he was directly responsible for this, but the Saints, especially in that first half, just pressured the lights out of Geelong.
Yeah, so that was, I mean, the second highest pressure factor of any first half. It's the third highest of any first half this season. But the thing with me for St Kilda, so yeah, their pressure was right up in the face. But another thing we spoke about last year on the podcast was St Kilda was defending too far back. They didn't have a lot of forward half intercepts. They were a pretty good team at moving the ball end to end. Their games were very open, low stoppages and things like that. So they were happy to let the team get it to, the opposition get it to 50, 60 metres out from their own goal before St Kilda would try to actively win it back and sort of, make sure they didn't get beaten out the back. The big thing that stood out for me in the first half against Geelong is they finished with 25 intercepts in the first half. 13 of those were in the forward half, 12 were in the back half.
So more than half.
So more than half were in the forward half of the ground. You go back 1 week against Adelaide and it was a smashing, and you can look at the numbers across last year, but against Adelaide it was 24 in the forward half across the game and 50 in the back half. So almost had twice as many. So it's just
being able to... Is it simple as being a directive, or is that Adelaide putting you on the back foot and suddenly you feel like you need to fold back and sit back later?
The numbers been looking like that for so long, I feel like it's a directive. It's the way Ross Lyon wants to play. We want to get back into... everyone get back into defence, win the ball back there, and they're pretty good at moving the ball from one end to the other. But you look at a lot of the successful teams, and they have 2 or 3 or 4 games per year where they're just winning the ball back in their forward half and kicking easy scores from the front half. St Kilda never had that game, so they're sort of... When I looked at them, the easiest way to sort of sum up St Kilda was their structure was just too far back.
Yep.
A lot of the things they were doing was just starting from too far back in the ground. The first half against Geelong, pressure was right up in their face, led to a lot of forward half intercepts, and it set them up for the victory.
It's sort of funny though, isn't it? I was just thinking off the top there, when Lyon was first at St Kilda and they were...
Forward half.
Forward half pressure. So that's Lyon a change on his part.
Yeah, Ross Lyon and Mick Malthouse in 2009 probably made time in forward half JB Data created the metric, but that became a metric where all the clubs started to look at it because of St Kilda and Collingwood's numbers were so far up ahead. I think it was mixed box they might have called it, and Ross Lyon. But they were the first two teams to really concentrate on. Hey, there's 2 halves of a footy ground. We're looking at the forward half and then we're looking at the back half, and that was 2009.
Yeah.
Probably before 2009, not many people were talking about halves of the ground. Now we look at back half, forward half, but we also got attacking midfield and defensive midfield, 2 sides of the line. So you're right. He invented the forward half press. It's something he hasn't been able to bring back in his 2 seasons at St Kilda so far.
And before we move on, the Eagles, quite valiant for a half. I mean, had the game on their terms early and it kind of just got whittled away by the reigning premier before they were able to just play their game and cruise out to the win.
Yeah, so I think Brisbane were playing their game the whole way. So one of the stats that stood out to me in the first half, Brisbane had 69 marks to West Coast 35 and had more uncontested possessions in that time. But contested possessions were 81 to 64 in West Coast favour. That's plus 17 in a half of football is pretty good. West Coast 5 goals straight from clearances in that first half as well. So similar to what we talked about Carlton and Melbourne, West Coast really did well in the hunger and in the contest and making it a scrap. But you could see even in that first probably 20 minutes in the game, West Coast were 4 goals to 1 in front, but you can still see Brisbane weren't giving up. All right, we'll be able to beat them on the outside. Yep. We don't want to get sucked into going contest. And Brisbane just stuck to their guns and finally overrun them in the end. But yeah, it was the contest work that set up West Coast. But then you look at their kicking efficiency as well, and it's probably something to do with inexperienced teams. Dropped every quarter, started at about 65%. dropped to 58, 55, and then 45 in the last quarter. So, again, tired legs going contest to contest.
28 degrees, the hotness of the afternoon, I think it was like 78% humidity.
I heard it was 100.
Was it?
So, yeah.
110 by the time the next week they tell the story. But I mean, the conditions were oppressive. And you'd expect a team based in that, I know that Perth can get hot, but Brisbane's a different kettle of fish, and you expect the Lions to be able to, I guess, mitigate that better.
Well, yeah, and you look at Brisbane's kicking efficiency, went up most quarters, but in that final quarter, West Coast was at 45%, Brisbane was at 71%. So they just looked a lot more in control. And
are we seeing a really obvious difference in the way West Coast are playing under McWalter to Simpson?
Yeah, well, one of the numbers, Simpson sort of took it away in recent years, but they've always been number one backwards kicking team the whole time. McWalter's and come from the Richmond background of just got to take ground as much as possible. So little quirky one that I have noticed, they're the only team yet to have a backwards kick.
Is that right?
Yeah. So every team's done it at least once or twice. West Coast are just trying to erase that out of their mind and just keep taking territory.
So you've got to take the small victories.
So just getting the ball moving forward first. And I think in that first half, you saw the guys that it's going to benefit, Dewar and Brockman and Liam Ryan, the guys that, the nippy sort of forwards and things that can, get the ball out in space if they can get the ball moving.
There were some classy finishes as well. Yeah.
He can play, Brockman.
Yeah.
He's been around a bit now, hasn't he? But
so they're guys that sort of, they're going to hurt you out the back. But yeah, as I said, with the West Coast, the whole thing was their contest work was really, really good to start with, but their skill and outside run just couldn't keep up for the 4 quarters.
Rohan, I've got a question for you. Who's it a big week for?
There's a few contenders. I'm tempted to go with Simon Goodwin, though, for a couple of reasons. One is that Melbourne, after being pretty good in round one, so, cut them some slack there.
Yep.
They're playing a really good side, but that was a miserable finish in your second game of the season to get run over the top by a side that was previously bottom 2, however promising their kids are. That doesn't augur well.
Yep.
And the other point is just that sort of, I won't say bizarre, but sort of strange moment in the press conference where he talked about Max Gawn's relative subdued game and mentioned sort of difficulties that he'd been through. And you'd hope, and I'd like to think he did surely talk to Max and said, look, I'm going to mention this, but it just seems if it's a personal matter, aren't you better off just not...
It wasn't even asked about specifically, it was offered up.
It's drawing attention to it unduly, and then you give people ammunition to say, you're trying to distract attention or whatever. So it didn't strike me as great media management, and that in itself doesn't mean a lot, but I think he is perceived as being one of the coaches under pressure anyway, so if they have a few more fade-outs of that nature, the pressure's going to start coming. And it's a big game, this one. They've got Gold Coast. I had a look at the record. Melbourne's won 15 out of 18 against Gold Coast. Gold Coast haven't beaten them since 2014. And it's at the MCG where Gold Coast barely ever win. But
well, they barely play, to be fair.
Yeah, well, but this is they did win their last round there last year against Richmond, but this is their best chance, I think, of beating a decent side on the G.
Fair enough. Christian, who's it a big week for?
I could probably run with this one for every week from this point onwards, but whoever gets the tap on the shoulder at Carlton this week, that's going to get the job on Sam Darcy. So he's going to cause a fair few teams some headaches. So since round 18 last year, he's taken the most contested marks in the forward 50 of any player. Since the start of last year, he's got the 5th best one-on-one win rate, but we just know how dominant he is in the air. I don't think they go Wiedering on him. So
he's 208 centimetres.
I know. So
there's not many that can kind of go with that.
Yeah, it's a scary matchup, I think, for most teams. But yeah, I think for Carlton, who are looking to try to bounce back and try to get their, as I said, their defence has been good, but this is one guy that could monster him and cause some issues.
You guys are probably too young, but remind you of anyone? Sam Darcy?
Go on.
I did hear your Paul Salmon comparison.
It's obvious. It's like, I think Fish, I was going to say, still is 209 centimetres, but he might have shrunk a bit. But that season he had in 84 for Essendon, kicked 63 in 13 games and then did his knee against Collingwood and missed out on a flag. So hopefully the comparison doesn't extend that far for Sam Darcy. But he's got an incredible vice-like grip on the footy, hasn't he?
Yeah, he does. And a good leap on him, a good kick. When you compare him to someone like Aaron Norton in the same forward line, I'm much more confident watching Darcy kick the footy than I am with someone like Norton. And I think you're right. Week to week, it's going to be, the magnet's going to be circled on the whiteboard, and it's a big question mark. Who gets this bloke every week? Because he's an incredibly tough matchup.
We don't have that many monster key defenders anymore, do we? The gorillas, they used to call them.
Yeah, they are. They're getting a lot more sort of.
Well, they can't be
athletic and
because Sam Darcy can pick it up off his toes.
Yeah.
He can mark the ball when he's at his highest point. Like there are all these things that he can do. Yeah, I don't envy the person that's going to have that job, and I don't want to speculate on who it might be for the Blues. I don't want to think about that too far in ahead. It's a big week for the 45 kick. We've just talked about it, and the two teams that do it the most, the Giants and the Hawks, and they're facing each other. A cracker Saturday night in Launceston. Bit of a shame, a little bit, with all due respect to those in Tasmania and those in Launceston, it's a bit off Broadway for the expectations of these two teams going forward.
How many night games have we had in Launceston?
It's a great question.
I honestly can't think of one. Have there been any? There might have been some pre-season.
Maybe some pre-seasons.
But yeah, not sure if there's actually.
But yeah, it should be a cracking match between two freewheeling teams, and maybe keep an eye out to see if the 45 is used.
Definite jumper clash there. I'll have to.
Oh, maybe
GWS will need to wear the black on
the grey. I reckon
I like
you might.
that one.
I do too.
Yeah,
keep an eye on that too.
The Darth Vaders.
The Darth Vaders. Is the hype justified or is it hyperbole? The segment where I say a statement, you tell me whether the hype is justified or if I'm speaking in hyperbole. Rohan, Sydney's win over the Dockers will kickstart their year and Dean Cox's tenure.
Absolutely justified. It was the first thing I thought when the siren went. This is the sort of thing that not only kicks off a coaching tenure, it can make a season for a side. It was a really gritty win, that. And given the calibre of players still missing from that side,
Yeah, sure.
Absolutely justified.
Ben Keys, Christian, could kick 40 goals this year if he keeps playing as a forward.
Oh, I think that's hyperbole. He's not going to get that 4 goals every week, and because they're such a stacked forward line, so I don't think Adelaide are going to kick 160 every week. But geez, the personnel they got down there, Thilthorpe, Rankin, Walker, Fogarty, Rochelle. Keys is almost 6th in line, so I know he got his 4 on the weekend, but I think there will be at least 2 Adelaide players kick 40 goals, but I don't think he'll be one of them.
How many would he kick if they played Essendon 4 times during the year?
Yeah, he seems to like playing them. He's kicking 9, is it, in his last 2 against
Has he really?
It's like Lance Franklin all over again.
And then last one, I'm going to throw it over to both of you. I want both of your thoughts on this one. The Eagles will beat the Dockers in this week's derby.
I don't think they will, but I think they'll give it a nudge. I mean, they beat them last year, and they're a better team now, I think. Yeah, I think it'll be close, but Freo's still for them.
Yeah, I know it's early in the season. This is probably the closest the team, looking at the profile and where Freo are at, especially at the moment, they're sort of, up for the taking. West Coast probably a really good chance to sort of strike with this one. The clearances for me, as I said, what West Coast did against Brisbane and what Freo have been trying to hang their hat on, I think the game starts for these two at the centre bounces and the clearances, so we can get the ascendancy there.
Tell you what, no shortage of good games to keep an eye on this week. And, after my tipping effort last week, I think I only got 4 out of 8, which was a bit rubbish. Make sure you get your tips in. Get them in early. Just trust your gut, because you never know early in these seasons how you will go. Rohan, thanks for filling in on short notice. Much appreciated, and good to have you back on the pod.
Anytime.
Christian, good to speak with you as always. To everybody at home, we will speak to you in the next episode.